The most profound symptom was the psychiatric presentation. And that's why I was misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder. I was then misdiagnosed with schizoaffective disorder. And that was shadowing everything else. But the seizures were why I got on a unit. That was the reason why I got to neurology. Seizures. No healthy, fully functioning person is going to fake seizures for attention. Doesn't that show that there's something going on?
Yeah. In this episode, I'm incredibly excited to share with you a discussion I had with Susannah Cahalan, author of my favorite book and maybe yours as well, called Brain on Fire. Now, if you've never read this book, first of all, it is a must read, but Susannah recounts her harrowing experience with anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis during a period in her life she calls her month of madness. This memoir offers a deeply personal account while also shedding light on broader issues in medicine and mental health. She was a complete delight to speak with, and I hope you enjoy our incredibly interesting conversation half as much as I did. So, Susannah Cahalan,
Yes.
I am so thankful that you are on this podcast. It truly is. Like I told you earlier, you were one of the first ones that we actually said, wouldn't it be great if Susannah Cahalan could come on? A large part of that is because of your New York Times bestseller, Brain on Fire, which is absolutely amazing. It is a must read in the field of neurodiagnostics, in the field of psychiatry, in the field of neurology, as I'm sure you're aware. You dedicated your life to other books, which we'll talk about that. I would love to see what you've been up to. But I wanted to really talk about first, like dive into the success of Brain on Fire, right? Because it's such a staple, almost a cult classic, if you will,
I love it.
in the neurodiagnostic field,
Oh, that's so cool.
and neurology field, and I really, and I put on a post saying what's your favorite book, and this was before I actually talked to you on email, and overwhelmingly, Brain on Fire was the number one, and that's through neurologists and neurodiagnostic technologists.
That is so cool.
And I'm curious, like I would like to share what I think, why,
Please.
but I would love to hear what you think. Why do you think that that Brain on Fire, healthcare people and caregivers in particular really gravitated towards Brain on Fire? Great
question. And at first I want to say thank you so much for having me on and for these kind words. And, when I was writing this book, I had no idea. I had no idea the life that it would have. Mm-hmm. And I also had no idea I thought maybe people who had my disease would be interested in it, maybe like neurologists who treated people. That made sense to me. But what's been interesting to me is how it's expanded beyond that. And I've never talked about my story. I've talked about it in a lot of different perspectives, but never from kind of EEG side. So I'm excited to dive into that today.
Yes. And
to your question about why Brain on Fire resonates in the medical world, I can't say for sure because there have been many other medical memoirs. I think part maybe is the fact that my memory was impaired from the experience. So even though, yes, it's very personal, it does kind of have a diagnostic remove, like almost like a clinical eye, especially in that second part where my memory is most unreliable. I really wasn't present.
Yeah.
So in some ways, it's almost like mimicking the doctor's perspective or the physician's perspective.
Yeah.
As I'm trying to kind of figure out what happened to me because I don't remember. So maybe that's what that's just a theory, but I'm curious what you would say about that.
Yeah. So my theory is this, and it's really not a theory. I think it's just very evident. Your book, the way you write in particular, is your storytelling is, first of all, it's an incredible story.
Yeah.
But that happened to you, and then how you took that and your storytelling, the way you write, it's just. I was re-listening to you on Audible, just preparing for this conversation, and it brought me back to when I first read the book, where I was just like, what happens next? I know what happens next, but every chapter ended with like, what is going on here? And I think you did a beautiful job just depicting, really telling the story of what you were going through. And even though you were looking at a lot of your memoirs, your notes, you were really able to, I think, transport back into maybe what you were experiencing and explaining it. I think that's the story, and the way you told it is number 1 and 2 of just absolutely fantastic. Number 3, I think it really puts healthcare professionals in the perspective of who they're taking care of. I think that's incredibly important. And I think healthcare professionals really want to make sure that they are empathetic with their patients, because the thing about it is we're doing this 24/7.
Yes.
We see patient in, patient out. And even actually in your book, you had said that your mom had actually talked to Dr. Russo, and she was saying something about a bet. And she was like, oh, that's unfortunate that they're talking about my daughter as a bet. But I think it is important that healthcare professionals can kind of distance themselves, and they can actually, and there is some, they keep humor alive when they're doing what they're doing. But I also know that for the patients, it's real.
Yeah.
And the healthcare professionals are empathetic when we're, around the patient and the patients we're trying to treat. But I do think that it is important that we have some sort of understanding of what the patient is going through, because we can get, hey, this is a job, this is what we do, and I've got to do a good job. I got to make sure that they're taken care of, and that's how.
It's such a difficult situation to be in, and one that I have a lot of respect for. I read a memoir that's coming out from a doctor, and describing how it's hard to maintain your humanity in the face of the onslaught of need and the brutality of things that you see, but also to keep that connection to the patient is very difficult, because the way that she described it, which I thought was so beautiful, was like beautiful and scary in some ways, was you're kind of relating to the patient, you're being empathetic, you're showing all the signs, but you realize that you're playing a role.
Mhm.
It's so hard to do that every time.
Yeah.
And it's hard for a patient to understand that, but through the process of talking to so many of these physicians, I really have a lot of respect for their situation. And I also have a lot of respect and empathy for the patient side. And it's such a hard dynamic.
Yeah.
It's really impossible. It's a circle that you can't square properly. It's hard. But the people who really try to keep their humanity, both with the patient and outside with their colleagues, it's a balancing act that is an impossible one, but worth trying to do it right.
Yeah.
And I think, even though there's a lot of examples of kind of failure I think ultimately, I hope that the book shows that there was a lot of success, not even just Dr. Najjar, who is the kind of hero, but even with a Dr. Russo and some of the other doctors who may, have behaved in ways that weren't, like Dr. Bailey.
Yeah.
He has a redemption as well. I think we're talking about, and by the way, I will say I changed their names because I didn't want to kind of damn a person based on one mistake and say their whole 50-year career meant nothing, because so I made that decision, and I gave people the option whether they wanted their names in. And I thought that was the fair thing to do, because it's not fair. It was a rare disease.
Yeah.
It was a real test. The people who quote unquote failed shouldn't be kind of villainized for the rest of their lives, or have some kind of, demark on their career. Like that wasn't something I was interested in doing.
When I was reading your book, throughout the whole book, I could really see how your understanding of both sides really played through. I think, you had that open mind throughout the book.
Thank you.
Even with the pronunciation of your last name, Cahalan.
Everyone does.
Yeah.
And I
Callahan.
could never, ever hold it against anyone.
Yeah. But the fact that you put it in the book, you were saying an understandable mistake. You didn't have to put that in the book. And I think that really just adds to the, how personable you are in the book and your writing style. Going back to why I think it's such a great book, and why I think people really gravitated to it.
Thank you.
But yeah, so going back to, the humanity of it, you really talked about a situation or whenever Dr. Najjar actually came down and knelt by your bed and said, "Hey, I'm not gonna leave you. I'm here for you. I'm not gonna hurt you." I really think that kind of stuff is what healthcare professionals really aim towards, right? I think there takes a specific person to be a healthcare professional, and they're drawn to empathy anyways. And I think over time, maybe you have to remove yourself from there, but I never think it's lost. And so I think when healthcare professionals in particular read your story, it reminds us about how, the other story, the story on the other side.
It's like, why you're doing this.
Exactly.
Like, why are you you're doing this to help people ultimately. And, the actual behavior and the interaction between doctor and patient is actually healing.
Yeah.
That context of the doctor and patient getting together, looking at each other in the eye, maybe touching each other, that's those do heal.
Yes.
Of course it's not going to heal cancer on its own, but I'm saying it has a role in the healing process. And, you do hear of doctors who are fantastic doctors but have no bedside manner. And I would argue that they aren't great doctors because the bedside manner is really such a big part of that process, that exchange. It's key and it's essential. And I was so lucky to have someone who was a brilliant doctor, but also managed to be like just so humane, so present in the way that he treats his patients.
Well, it sounds maybe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you actually went through a few doctors who might not have had great bedside manner, or tell us your experience from what you remember or from looking at your journal or what your parents and your loved ones has said. Tell me your experience about really your healthcare journey.
Yeah. It's funny because I would say that we actually had some people who had one. So we had, I've changed his name in the book and I don't remember his name that I used, but there was one doctor who was leading the team, lovely man, teddy bear of a person, but he ultimately gave up on the case and devastated my mother. Yeah. So he had a great bedside manner, but he didn't ultimately have what it took to solve this very difficult case. And I don't say that he's not brilliant enough, but in this particular time, he couldn't do it. So, you have that, so you can have one and not the other. And then you can have both, and you can have only the bedside manner or bad bedside manner and brilliant mind. And I think we saw the gamut. I mean, I think my first neurologist who misdiagnosed me was overworked. I mean, very, very highly regarded, older, but clearly just overworked. Just the amount of people that were waiting to see him in the waiting room, it was very evident that he was in high demand. And I kind of came in and I didn't fit the kind of type of patient he was seeing. Most of the patients were elderly and had chronic neurological issues. And I didn't quite have that profile, obviously. And I think instead of saying, I don't know, he came to kind of pretty damning conclusions in the beginning, which was that I was drinking too much alcohol. Yeah. So those kind of flash judgments because maybe we're tired or we don't want to admit that we don't know, that those can have huge implications and nearly did for me. Luckily, I was able to kind of, that never really truly followed me, but it did kind of change the initial approach for sure.
And so the frustration that you must have felt with the misdiagnosis, do you remember any part of that? Do you remember any part of your struggle with saying, hey, it isn't this, and then you're going to another neurologist? Like, what did that feel like, if you remember?
Yeah, initially, because I had one-sided numbness, and then I got a diagnosis of mono, and I thought that, they said, oh, it's probably mono, and then it wasn't. Okay. And then the behavioral issues, I did not connect. Yeah. So I was very much like mind, body were different. Yeah. And so when I got the initial diagnosis of bipolar disorder, I believed it. And I was relieved because I thought, oh, I have an answer. Like there's a name for this. And there's like all these famous people who are, thriving with this condition and are artists. And I thought, okay, like that made sense to me. So in some ways I was my worst advocate. Later on, when I was very delusional, I would say things to doctors like, I have multiple personality disorders. I was like working against the actual path towards the right diagnosis by just misdiagnosing myself.
Right.
So I was in on that
Yeah.
issue,
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, that's fascinating. I think it's in our nature to go and look for
Yeah.
what is going on with
We
us.
want a name.
Yeah, we want a name.
Mhm.
And where do you think that transition happens from, a patient who is worried when they go into the doctor that the doctor is going to say they have something to something is affecting their lives so negatively that they actually, when they go to the doctor, they want to hear something like a diagnosis? When do you think that transition happens? Is it when they're just tired of dealing with their symptoms and they want a fix? And do you think it's because if they have the diagnosis that they'll be able to attack it? And what do you think about that?
I think in general, people want a name. I think having, even if it's not a profound illness, but if it affects your life in any way, you want to know that there's other people,
Yeah.
that there's kind of a path. I think having an unknown, and unknowns are often linked with, well, it's all in your head or it's psychological. And so it can go down that route as kind of, and then that route goes like a little bit of a blame game kind
Right.
of thing. So I think in general, being on a kind of concrete, solid ground is so important to people. And I think that's why sometimes doctors do push for a diagnosis too early.
Yeah.
Before maybe the facts are present, or maybe without acknowledging the grays or acknowledging the fact that this is kind of a rule out diagnosis, or saying that, but most patients don't understand what that means, and they want it so bad. And I think at some point people want a diagnosis, even if it's a terminal diagnosis, because you just want to know.
Yeah.
The unknown is so scary. So uncertainties, you can't move forward. There's no progress. You can't get your bearings.
Yeah.
And I've seen that time and again. People just want a word for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's coupled with, the downside, like you just said, is whenever you're pushed a certain diagnosis,
Yes.
number one, you're headed down a treatment path that
Yes.
doesn't help you.
Yes.
But also, whenever, psychologically speaking, like whenever you were excited that it was bipolar and then you found out it wasn't,
Yeah.
you had mentioned in your book that it was like, man, just another, okay, now what is it? And the ups and downs of that has to be, has to tear you up psychologically speaking.
Absolutely. And I think what also is let's say with kind of treatment resistant depression or something like that, where you have a diagnosis, but nothing that we have to offer actually helps it.
Yeah.
That's also so hard. And you start to wonder, like, do I have this condition that I supposedly have? It's horrible to be in that position and to not find answers and to not have like a community. I think that can be very helpful, especially with chronic illnesses, to look towards other people who have gone through a similar thing. You don't have that. That's hard.
Yeah. Before we get into, a lot of the medical side, I want to pause and kind of go backwards.
Sure.
And really, because, for those who are listening, you just kind of sit down on a couch and you just start talking in this microphone. And Susannah and I were just talking and it was going so well. We were like, well, let's just keep going. But I do know that, people are interested in your life. And so I would love to hear a little bit about how you got into journalism,
Sure.
how you started at 17 years old. And then I would love to hear after that, where you're going. So tell us a little bit about how you decided you wanted to be a journalist.
Oh gosh. Well, my mom is a big newspaper person.
Yeah.
And I loved writing
Yeah.
and worked on my newspaper in high school. And I think, I've always loved the thing, people get into journalism for various reasons. And like one of them is to like make the world a better place, you'd hope, or something, which that's nice. And that's part of it. But it's also kind of getting into people's heads and understanding them. And I've always loved that. So I always loved the kind of more human interest news. I mean, I've done breaking news. I'm not as good at it. It's hard work.
Yeah, I bet.
That is tough. And people who do it are awesome. But for me, I did like the longer form kind of ability to kind of climb inside someone's mind. And I'm very curious. I think that's where it comes from. I like to know about people's lives and how they live them and how they see the world and their philosophies. Like that excites me.
Yeah.
And ideas excite me too. I like to talk about concepts, and we all do. And some ideas excite me, some ideas don't. But
Yeah.
and so then when I went to college, I just focused on writing. I didn't do journalism in college, but I did start working at the New York Post when I was 17. So I was still in high school.
How did you get that job?
That was through my mom's friend, worked at the New York Times, and was like, they're not gonna have any opportunity here if you start from as a kid. And, but at the New York Post, they had an old school kind of approach, which was, I'm not sure if they do have this anymore, but they had copy kids. They literally called them kids. Many of them were not kids.
Yeah.
But you'd get coffee, you'd make copies, you'd pass them out.
Work your way up type of situation.
And if there was a fire or something happening, in one of my cases, a machete murder, they would say, okay, go. We don't have any other reporters. Go up to the Bronx. Yeah. And so that's how it started. And so you just wait, and kind of like be scared because you kind of didn't want to be called, but did. And that's how I began at 17. And every year I'd get more and more stories. And then I ended up working for the Sunday paper, which allowed me not only to report, but to pitch my ideas and write them. And you could do more human interest stuff there. And I started doing that a lot. In my summers off of college, I would go there, breaks from college, I would work, and started to contribute there. And then I had a big kind of coup where I interviewed someone in prison it was a horrible story, who had kidnapped 2 boys and in St. Louis, in Missouri, and had one for many years. There was a kind of a Stockholm syndrome kind of under element to it. Mm-hmm. And it was a time, it was one of those news stories that captures a nation. And I just went in and tried to interview him, and he talked to me because I think I was disarmingly young and very newbie. Yeah. I mean, really, I started I went to see him in prison, and there's plexiglass, and I just started talking. You can't just talk. You have to pick up the phone and talk to him. I just saw him and I just started talking, and I think it threw him off, and he talked to me, and and that was like a big story that I got at, I think I was 21. Yeah. And that kind of set me off. That
catapulted you. Mm-hmm. As I told you earlier, a small town kid in Texas, hearing someone say, well, I started at the New York Times and then I went to the Post, and it's all just really cool to actually
I didn't start the Times.
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. Sorry.
That would be an interesting. Yeah, no.
There was a connection between.
There was a community newspaper in there as well, in my high school newspaper. But yes, no, it is. I mean, I was lucky. I grew up in New Jersey, suburban New Jersey. My mom worked in the district attorney's office in Manhattan. So I would come into the city quite a bit, and it just shows you like just proximity to that kind of thing that gives you an opportunity, which that's obviously really cool. I had an opportunity through just my mom knew, which I was happy about.
It's funny because there's a lot of parallels with people in the medical industry.
Oh, is there? Tell me.
Is that, just what you were just saying, that you really like to understand what's going on. Mm-hmm. You like to maybe chase down the story and investigate it.
That's exactly what it is.
And really see what's going on, and really kind of bring to light the things that people wouldn't necessarily see unless someone actually did it. You kind of take that responsibility on of like, okay, you're the one I'm going to take care of. And for you, it'd be like, right, that's the story I'm going to unravel. And it's like, let's unpack everything that's going on in this patient or the story.
I've never kind of thought about it that way, but you're right. And actually you crystallized better than I did why I like journalism is because I'm nosy and I love a puzzle. Yeah. And I like to figure things out, and I like to investigate, and I like to hunt down facts, and I love an archive, and I like talking to people.
And there's really, in your book, in Brain on Fire in particular, there's another reason why I think a lot of people gravitate towards it in the healthcare industry is there's an element of kind of textbookish. You talk about the hippocampus, you talk about the NMDA receptor that are more prevalent in the hippocampus. You talk about a lot of things that are really science heavy, and you kind of pepper that in with such a great story and a great way to tell it, that I think you are absolutely just a perfect fit for telling a story in the medical arena, right? Kind of like how you are now with uncovering The Great Pretender. The book that you wrote is it's mental health based, right? And I think you really are really good at unpacking the medical side and the storytelling
Oh,
side.
thank you. Because I do like I love the facts.
Yeah.
Like I fell in love with the science of the NMDA receptor and encephalitis, and all these little like avenues of even EEG. I went down an avenue there, and just and all these things I didn't know about, and I really had to my editor had to pull me back because I really wanted to go even deeper.
Go even deeper.
And
Yeah.
I'm happy that you did because
I think it was just such a great, I think it was a good move. And the way you kind of explained it, it was being a healthcare professional. I think any healthcare professional will tell you watching movies, reading books, especially if it's in their field, or kind of snobs. And it's so frustrating to us. And honestly, when I was listening to you talk about the EEG, I was like, she could teach me a lot.
Oh no.
100%.
Well, I will say, I have to give credit where credit is due.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not someone I like to show my work to people who are experts. So I had a lot of physicians, I had experts reading it to make sure that I wasn't making mistakes. And I did make a lot of mistakes and they fixed them.
Of course. And that is smart. This podcast in particular, and I do educational videos, they're vetted through my colleagues as well as an epileptologist. I just think it's responsible to do that.
I do too.
Yeah.
There are a lot of journalists who will not show sources, what they write about them. And I record a lot of my interviews. So if I can confirm through recording, then I'm comfortable. But oftentimes I will share, especially if I'm worried about jargon, the use of like scientific jargon that might be over my own head. And am I communicating this correctly? It's important to me.
Absolutely.
And fact checking in general is very important to me.
I think that just validifies you as one of the top reporters out there, and that's why you have such success. So speaking of, the scientific terms and stuff, autoimmune encephalitis, let's talk about that, which is what you experienced and what the book Brain on Fire is actually about. So give us a little bit of an overview of what that is and how that affected you.
Absolutely. So autoimmune encephalitis in general is when the body's immune system begins to target certain areas of the brain. In my case, it was the NMDA receptor. And the NMDA receptor are located all over the brain. I mean, if you knock out the NMDA receptors, mice models die. Mice die in animal models. But if you kind of mess up various areas of kind of where they are, you can mess with learning, memory, and behavior. And you see that through the course of my illness. So in the beginning, when the illness was beginning to kind of reveal itself, you saw kind of lethargy, kind of flu-like symptoms, malaise, kind of depression. And then as it started ramping up and my brain was kind of really being, the NMDA receptors in my brain were really being targeted, then you saw massive shifts in mood. I basically lost my ability to retain memories. And over time, I was heading towards catatonia. And those are when the receptors were kind of being pulled into the cell, weren't engaging at all. So first you have kind of an overexcited receptor, overproducing. And that's when you have these outrageous behaviors and you have these high heart rates and fluctuations all over the place. And that's when that's when it's kind of disease is at its most, when it's like at its most vibrant in a way. And then when the cells start becoming, when the receptors start being cut or sucked into the cell, then you start to see the catatonia. And in some cases, people go into coma, they lose the ability to breathe on their own and have to be intubated. And some people die. So that's the kind of course of the illness. I never got to that point. Thankfully, mine was identified and treated in time for me to recover before that happened.
And you were one of 200?
Yeah, 217.
Yeah.
It's amazing. And at that time, there were just a few papers written about this. And the first paper that described this illness was by Joseph Dalmau at the University of Pennsylvania at the time. And his first paper was 2005, and it featured 5 women. 2 years later, it got a name, and that was, I think, up to 10 women. So, that was a few years before I was diagnosed in 2009. So, it only had a name 2 years before.
And it seems that there is, and I'm no expert on autoimmune encephalitis. I do EEGs, but from my research, it seems like the patients who actually experience this autoimmune encephalitis, that their experiences are really similar to each other.
Yeah,
right.
That's true.
And you had mentioned that with the NMDA, it's so important that mice. I think you were saying in your book that if you take NMDA away from mice in particular, they won't learn to suckle, and they won't learn to take care of themselves, and within 10 days they'll die. So is that essentially what was happening at the very end stages of what you're experiencing, or what patients could experience?
I think it's hard for me to say exactly, because what's interesting, what seems to happen with this condition is that a percentage of people will recover spontaneously without intervention, which is fascinating. Yeah. And I actually get emails from people a lot. In 1980, I have the exact same course, and I was told it was a nervous breakdown, and I've recovered. I still have some memory things, but mostly I've been able to get a job and live my life. Some people are profoundly impaired, and some people die. Yeah. So it does seem to affect people differently. And, we don't have necessarily a natural history of the illness without a treatment, because by the time it was discovered, had learned, we've obviously fine-tuned it and gotten better over time. But, once that illness had a name, there was treatment for it. And so it's hard, there was no trajectory of the illness kind of undiagnosed, or, you can find many different examples in the medical literature, people who likely had this in the past. But in terms of following people and having an actual diagnosis, we don't really have that. So it's very unclear to say what would happen to me had I not been diagnosed. But I would venture to say I wouldn't be here in the way that I am now. Yeah.
How much exposure did this, in particular, autoimmune encephalitis have before Brain on Fire? Was it a well-known thing that was going on?
It wasn't.
Yeah.
I would say that within the medical field, it was growing. Dr. Joseph Dalmau is an incredible ambassador for this kind of field that he launched. Yeah. And he was doing the work that he needed to do in neurology specifically. And it was growing. I mean, the doctor who diagnosed me only knew about it because he had read the papers that Dalmau had written. But in terms of kind of a general knowledge about that, now we see very early diagnosis and treatment in ER level, GPs, gynecologists, that wasn't happening then. And there were many different factors that happened, and I think Brain on Fire was one of them, which is amazing.
Absolutely, 100%. And I hear that in the neurologist community as well. Wow, whenever I posted on Reddit, actually, that I was going to interview you, and if there were any questions, it was like, "Oh, this,
that is so cool."
That's what they said. Has there been any change in how they diagnosed it back then to how they diagnose it now? Is there technology moving that way? Do you see how the future is going to be with the diagnosis process?
I think the biggest thing that changed since I was diagnosed, there are a few things, but one is that now it's on the autoimmune panel when you send it out. When you're looking for all the things that they were looking for in me, like lupus or various other MS or other autoimmune illnesses. On that panel is autoimmune encephalitis now. That's awesome. That is, I think that's a huge win.
That's huge because especially if, thinking back, if that would have been when you first were going through your experience, having that.
It would have saved us a couple weeks, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely.
And for people, I think a lot of people would have saved them even more time than that. I was, in the scheme of things, diagnosed very quickly.
Yeah.
But that, to me, is one of the biggest changes. Another one is just the different kind of treatments that are available now. I didn't have rituximab or any of the chemotherapy agents that I would probably have had I been sick now. Also, there are a few different treatments that are now going through clinical trials that are specifically for autoimmune encephalitis, which is very exciting.
Yeah.
So yeah, the landscape has really shifted, and the understanding of kind of like what to do, how to intervene, kind of the aggressive treatment it needed. There were a lot of examples of people doing kind of removing ovaries because there's a percentage of people who have teratomas in ovaries, and I think that has kind of stopped. I think it still does happen maybe in cases where that's necessary, but I think that was like one of the first line treatments in the beginning. That's no longer the case. So there has been massive shifts, and in the way that the biggest shift is this early diagnosis, and now the kind of struggle is, well, we have this recovery, and I think it's about 70 to 80% of people recover. But is that recovery full? And that fullness of recovery is very hard to actually, if you don't have a baseline kind of written down and acknowledged and documented, it's very hard to say, okay, well, maybe you can go back to work, but are you functioning at the level that you were before? Or, what has been taken, where's your memory versus, before, versus, is a question of like, how do we get people back to the fullness that they were before? And I think it's a big area of interest now.
And how, if you don't mind me asking, do you feel like there's any long-term lasting effects that you're actually experiencing, or do you think you made a complete full recovery?
No, I made a complete full recovery.
Yeah.
I'm very lucky in terms of that. I don't think, I've been a bad judge of that over the years, but people who know me very well would say that I've recovered fully. Yeah.
That's amazing. That's absolutely amazing. So the EMU was a big part of the book.
Yes.
Of your experience. Do you remember any of that?
Yes.
You do. Tell us a little bit about, for the neurodiagnostic professionals kind of listening in, tell us about your experience of that whole.
There's two EEG experiences that I remember, one was before I was hospitalized, where the woman did the EEG, and I think she said that it was all in my head, but I have no idea. I don't remember. I mean, I was so unreliable at that point. I was so delusional. I don't know if the tech said it to me or not.
And to you now, you can't differentiate that.
I have no idea.
Okay. Yeah.
I remember her saying it, but I can't tell you if it's real or not. So that's bizarre. Yeah. I remember the smell of like the glue.
The glue.
I remember the backpack, like a pink backpack.
Yeah.
And the hat. And feeling like it was itchy. And I remember like afterwards, my scalp being very, very sore from it.
Yeah.
But in terms of the unit itself, it was with 3 other people in that room. So it was 4 people in total. And that was where my psychosis was the worst, because you had 3 other sets of doctors, 3 other sets of nurses, 3 other sets of family members coming in and out. So it was just a lot of noise and a lot of activity. And psychosis is amplified. In the context does have an influence on the level of psychosis. So I was my most psychotic during that time, I think, because of how it was like a bustling unit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so an EMU experience probably in your experience would be better if it was isolated to one room.
They did that later. I was so psychotic that they did a 1-to-1, and then I was in my own room, and it was better. But yeah. And I'm seeing in my experience now that really is kind of the norm now, is where they actually separate the patient, because I think it's, epilepsy and seizures in general is so personal. So vulnerable.
It's like, I would not want to share that experience with other people. No. There might be people listening now where they say their EMU or their AMU is, it's not separated. But yeah, every experience that I've had, it is in separate rooms.
That's so interesting. And I commend that decision, because it is a very odd thing, because you are meant to have a seizure, right? You want that to be captured. And the fact that you're around other people. I mean, again, you do have a kind of naked vulnerability when that happens. Yeah. And it's that anxiety of this could happen any second, or should happen, or I want it to happen so I can leave, or that's hard to be around other people during that time.
With your experience in nurses, techs, aside from the doctors, what was your experience with them like? Was it a positive experience? Are there any things in particular that really stood out to you where you felt, you had mentioned that the bedside manner is part of the treatment.
Yeah.
It helps people get better. I 100% agree with you on that. And
Mhm.
I think most people would. Is there anything from a patient perspective that you can remember where you just felt okay with that person? Of course, you had actually gone into your illness so much that I think you were weary of just about everybody. But
Mhm.
is there one in particular moment where you think healthcare really kind of helped you there?
I mean, I think a lot of moments.
Yeah.
But the ones that really that resonate with me, and I mean, I don't have a lot of memories, so like a lot of them are kind of false memories
Sure.
because I've recreated it and through other people's eyes. But the ones that I know that are mine because they were in my journal, I had a little journal and I could write again, were the nurses' assistants who bathed me. So they were very loving and they were very gentle, and I looked forward to those baths because being in a hospital for a month is you're pretty gross, and you just want to feel clean.
Yeah.
And they really took care of me in this kind of very wonderful way, and I remember that so deeply. I remember that as much as I remember the doctor who saved my life. Like that was very meaningful to me to be treated that way.
Amazing. When you look back at those things, do you feel like, and I know you touched on this a little bit in your book, but I'd love to hear it from you. Do you feel like that was someone else completely different?
Well, not completely different. It's like a very close friend. It's like your best friend.
Oh, yeah.
Or like a sister, or, maybe even a younger, at this point now it's a younger version of myself. I have a disconnected feeling about it, like you would your childhood or something.
Yeah.
It's very close, but it's like so far too,
If you could go back in time and actually be a patient, is there some sort of loss of dignity that you would want to remain intact as a patient? So let's say you're in the ICU and you are getting bathed. What's going on in your mind as far as like, I want to keep my dignity intact, and how can a nurse or a technologist help protect that?
I think part of it is having kind of like as much of your norm there. So wearing your own clothes. I did have that, and I'm wearing my own clothes meant a lot. Not being in a gown.
That was important to you.
Yeah, it was important. But then also just in general, there it was a teaching hospital, so oftentimes you'd have groups of residents coming in and talking about you like you weren't there. And there were some specific times that were, again, this is through my dad's eyes because I don't remember, but there was one time when they talked about having to remove my ovaries, that they might have to remove my ovaries. And that was the first time we had heard about it. And it was told to a class. And that was like, you're an animal at the zoo. That was the worst kind of dehumanization. And my dad was very upset and expressed his anger to them. So that would be an example of like a time where you're kind of debased in a way as a patient.
So a healthcare worker in the university setting, in an academic setting, am I hearing you say that, obviously those conversations have to take place, but two things that could help with that is, hey, is everything that we're saying, does the patient know?
Yes.
Or does the patient's family know?
Right.
Because there's HIPAA laws that protect the patient, even from their own family. So is everything we're about to talk about, the patient is aware of? And also, maybe since that conversation does have to happen bedside, is there something they could say beforehand that you think would help the patient feel more comfortable? Hey, listen, my name is Dr. So-and-so. I have these students here. You're an interesting case that we're really wanting to dive into. We're going to talk about what's going on, and please don't look at this as, dehumanizing. We're actually just talking about your diagnosis. Do you think something like that at the beginning of that would actually help?
I don't know. Maybe that happened. I don't know,
True. Yeah.
All that I can remember, it's like goes back to that maxim, like people don't remember what you said, but how you made them feel.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's like they could have said all those things with like a straight face and no soul to it. And but then went ahead and said something, delivered this. Again, it wasn't to me. It was to the group.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Najjar had actually did that with you, and it was so impactful to you that you
Right.
remembered it, or at least you put it in your journal or something.
Yeah, I mean, that was my parents who
Yeah.
really, that was so, I mean, for me, I don't remember. I do, I have a memory of it, but it's a
Yeah.
false memory.
Yeah.
But it was my parents who were really
Yeah.
moved by that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely amazing. So your diagnosis was ultimately uncovered by a few medical professionals.
Yes.
How important is it that interdisciplinary physicians actually work together?
Oh, it's key. I
Yeah.
mean, that was like for a while, like the key takeaway for me, I thought, I hoped from the book was like the kind of working together of the different specialties, and then not the siloing off of psychiatry is really dangerous, especially in illnesses, neurological illnesses that present with psychiatric conditions and features. And
Mhm.
I would argue like a lot of illnesses that we don't even acknowledge do present with some psychiatric, symptoms,
Yeah.
depression for one, just if you're very attuned to kind of change the behavior, you're going to see a shift in behavior and with that accompanies many different illnesses. And so to me, the idea of working together as much as you can holistically, looking at the patient from top to bottom and thinking holistically and globally, even within specialties, is so key too. Because, when you're looking at someone just through the lens of that one area that you specialize in, you fail to see that big picture. And that's why Dr. Najjar was so impactful, because even though he was a neurologist with this very hyper-focused specialization, he was able to kind of get the full picture for the first time. Everyone noticed certain symptoms piecemeal according to what they were like looking at or what area they were interested in. But he was the one who kind of put the full picture on the map and on the page.
Yeah. And you had mentioned there was a great neurologist who probably just threw a dart and said, hey, this is, because you didn't fit the dynamics.
Yeah.
For people who are going to read your book but haven't read your book yet, can you explain a little bit about if there was any breakdown in how you think doctors could have communicated with each other, actually maybe did what Dr. Najjar did at the end? If they was there any experience that you had at the beginning of that?
I think probably they could have talked to my parents.
Yeah.
And sat down with them and really gotten like the full history. He also handwrote.
Oh.
I know that's not a thing anymore, but I do think that there's something to that, because I had the sense that there was like a kind of cutting and pasting going on, which I understand. Like, this is not the fault of the person. It's the fault of the system that doesn't allow enough time. But people are strapped for time and they can't sit down with the parent and go through the history of the illness for an hour like you did. That, most people aren't afforded that time.
Yeah.
But that was key for him too.
Yeah. I think, looking back on your book, the fact that Dr. Najjar really just opened up and wanted a lot of input from a lot of physicians and really looked at it entirely.
Yeah.
Your case is really kind of what really broke through.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree for sure. When did you read my book?
I read your book in 2000. Let's see. I want to get it right. 2013.
2013.
Yeah.
So really soon after it was written, because it came out in 2012. So you were like very early on.
I think everyone was
really
in my field. Yeah.
Wow.
It was such a buzz.
Really?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the thing about that book is it really, you do such a good job of explaining what was going on. And it's almost like we got a glimpse of, and again, I know you referred to your notes a lot and journals and what people said, but you're able to put that like first person perspective together so well. And so interestingly, that it was a buzz immediately, because because EEG is a huge part of it, because
seizures saved my life.
Yes, that's right. Talk about that a little bit.
I mean, absolutely. Listen, the most profound symptom was the psychiatric presentation. And that's why I was misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder. I was then misdiagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, and that was shadowing everything else. But the seizures were why I got on a unit, that they were an EMU unit. That was the reason why I got to neurology. Seizures.
Yeah.
But what was interesting was it was never fully captured ictally. So I had an experience when they tried to induce a seizure in the doctor's office, and I had this weird experience with the tech, which I remember her saying something, but who knows if she said it.
Was that the hyperventilation, what we call, where you breathe slow and then start breathing
they
faster?
did the
strobe
lights,
light.
the lights.
The photic strobe. Yeah.
Yes, and there was no seizure there.
Yeah.
And then I had a seizure in the waiting room, in the kind of emergency waiting for a bed, and got a bed through that way.
Yeah.
And then while I was there, never like a full grand mal seizure.
Yeah.
But I had events because I have video.
Yep.
The reason why I have video of myself, they're all from the monitoring.
Yeah.
From the hospital, so that the cameras. And so I had about, let's say there's 10, 12 events that were captured during the month long I was in, but never a grand mal seizure.
Yep.
So there was a talk, because these were subacute seizures, that maybe these were pseudo seizures, which is mind-boggling.
You're presenting with
predominant psychiatric.
Yeah.
And so the thought was, maybe these are pseudo seizures. And that was when they were talking about moving me out of neurology and into psychiatry fully. But the seizures put me on the path where they opened it up to other possibilities. And it, since I had so many witnesses to these seizures, and there was a real push to try to figure that out. Yeah. When they couldn't, there was kind of a movement towards pseudo seizures that started to crop up into my medical record. But luckily, by the time I was diagnosed, that was obviously not discussed anymore. But
there's been a huge push towards pseudo seizure, PNES, pseudo non-epileptic seizures, that they actually are seizures. They're not epileptic seizures.
Right. So
PNES, psychogenic non-epileptic seizures.
Interesting.
Because they have to be taken. They have to be taken with all seriousness, because something's going on.
Exactly.
Right. And your story is so common where you don't have the seizure, because catching a seizure is a lot like fishing, right?
Interesting.
It's like you could have a normal brain pattern, take off your EEG, and then all of a sudden you go into a seizure, right?
Well, it was like the woman I shared the room with, who she got seizures only when she drank. And they wouldn't let her drink. Yeah. And then she finally drank and she had a seizure. But she was, let me out of here, just give me a drink.
Yeah.
A
wine.
Yeah. And I think that's what she did. Yeah. But yeah, I know that's so, I never heard of that. I would love to have used that, like fishing. It's great.
And I think, there is something to that, especially in your case, is like, if you think it's PNES, we'll look into it.
Yeah.
Look into it more. And I really, truly, that's where we've kind of evolved into. It's like we take PNES as serious.
Let's think about it just rationally. No healthy, fully functioning person is going to fake seizures for attention.
Right.
Let's say that's what it is.
Yeah.
That's the underlying, if we're kind of fabricating a seizure, it's probably with this kind of like psychiatric attention seeking, whatever fugue state, or it's about trauma, whatever it is. Doesn't that show that there's something going on?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
And again, there's this mind-body thing where we're separating them when we shouldn't be. But and the subacute seizure thing was really an eye-opening for me.
Yeah,
that is a real thing, and that was happening to me. And I was having staring episodes and things that weren't being captured.
There's so many different types of seizures, though, that it's like a grand mal isn't really the end all be all. It's like you can have focal seizures that really never spread into, we call them complex partial, and you actually talked about that in your book. And it's like, it's long gone are the days where you didn't have a seizure because you're not on the ground flopping like a fish, right? It's like there's so many different
tools have gotten better. So now we can find the things that we thought were just not there. I mean, again, it makes so much sense.
Yeah. And going down kind of your path of like, well, if it is PNES and you investigate it further, because obviously with what you were going through, that can't explain everything.
No.
Of course you can have a EEG on a patient, they have a PNES episode, and you say, okay, this is psychogenic, this is not epileptogenic. So we will go that route.
Right.
There were so many
Yes.
other factors happening with you that
Yes.
I think it was smart that the neurologist
Yes.
said, hey, okay, something, even if they are PNES, something's going on. So let's really investigate further. And if you do that, if you continue with the EEGs, if they're needed, that you can actually catch them. And conversion disorder is a big thing where it's like they're having seizures, epileptic seizures, and psychogenic non-epileptic seizures. Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of times there are patients who they have seizures so much and they're so frustrated that they aren't captured on an EEG that they will actually mimic a clinical seizure on the EEG just because they're just tired of not catching them.
Wow.
I mean, that's an actual thing too.
Really?
So, yeah, I don't know how prevalent it is, but there's cases out there that the thing is, seizures and epilepsy is so tough to catch.
I think most people don't understand how complicated this is. Think, okay, well, you just, if you have seizures, it will show up. It's like a blood test. It's not that way.
Yeah. And even now, the stigma around epilepsy, patients who have epilepsy, it's just so, I'm on these epilepsy support groups, and just hearing what they go through really is heartbreaking.
It is.
Where they have, their company or whatever will say, you only, I saw this one post, and I don't know if it's true, but if it is, it's absolutely heartbreaking. This patient had, or this poster had a seizure that lasted like 30 seconds. And then they were quote unquote back to normal. They weren't showing big signs of postictal alteredness. And so the patient, or I keep saying patient, the poster had called and said, I had a seizure this morning. And he said, well, you're better in like 30 minutes. Why don't you just come in after that? And he's like, well, I have different types of seizures, and this one kind of leaves me pretty tired and fatigued. And
you want to be like, oh, I'd like to see how you would do.
What would you say? Yeah. How would you feel?
Just because I have a chronic condition that happens to me a lot doesn't mean that that's any less profoundly kind of like exhausting.
Yeah.
When it happens. Yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons why, epilepsy is just so fascinating to me.
Yeah. And the more you can document it, the more the work that you're doing, the better it will be for people like that to just say, well, look at this.
Yeah.
Like I can actually show you the patterns that what's happening in my brain. And the more you can map that for people, I think the less stigmatized things are.
And do you think you would do that if you were to go back where you document a little bit more of your seizure activity? Like, let's talk about the patient side, and they are frustrated because they're not catching those. Like, what would you say to those patients? I think you just kind of touched on it a little bit, like document every time, time of day. Like,
I would even say, listen, I don't like this, but I can tell you it is important to like videotape them.
Yeah.
Video, not video. Phone, with your phone.
Yeah.
Camera phone.
Phone tape them.
Yeah, phone tape them. I'm old.
You got my VHS.
I remember my VHSs. But document them in any way that you can. Write them down. I think that's more information that you can give a doctor, give a tech, the better, I think. I mean, do you agree?
I think documenting the food, their mental state, their...
Oh, yeah. Also, you want to know if there are triggers.
Yeah, triggers. Did they have alcohol? Did they not have alcohol? Sleep deprivation, stuff like that. Time of day. I think, absolutely. If I was giving advice to a patient who's dealing with epilepsy and there wasn't any capturing of it on the EEG, and they're going through that process, obviously the neurologist, if they're a good neurologist, she or he is going to say, hey, you need to do this anyways. Right. But I would probably emphasize it a little bit more is absolutely, like you said, as much information as you can. Lean on your parents, and I'm sure your parents seem to be a great support system.
They were.
How important was that to have a support system going through that?
Essential. I mean, again, I wasn't advocating for myself. I was saying I have multiple personality disorder, so I wasn't able to do that work. Yeah. And so the fact that they were there for me and writing things down, and really, sharing a notebook, and my mom and my dad are very smart. They're able to do that. I'm very lucky.
Yeah.
They felt comfortable asking questions, which people get very intimidated by. Someone who's, a doctor, it's very hard to question authority.
Yeah.
And they felt comfortable doing that, or at least not question authority, but just,
of course,
say, oh, well, can you explain that to me? I don't really understand. They felt comfortable doing that. And I think that I was so lucky that they were there to do that. And then also just physically present, which was key too.
I think there is a wave of understanding with physicians in general that there is that kind of cloud of almost intimidation, whether they portray it or not. And I see this all the time with physicians that I interact with is a lot of them are just so humble and so, personable. And I think a lot of that has to do with they're aware of how their bedside manner or the intimidation factor.
There's a hierarchy, right?
There is.
Of knowledge, right? There are things that I don't know. So we are out of balance.
Yeah.
And anything that doctors can do to kind of reinstate a sense of kind of, we'll never be fully balanced, but the idea that you're in kind of safe, that lack of balance is actually a safety measure. That's okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I mean, you can think about it, kind of a little trick that you could think about if you're a patient actually listening is imagine they are coming into your field of expertise, right? It's like before you knew a ton about EEGs, you had experience as a reporter. Imagine the doctor, asking you everyone has their expertise.
Right. Some more than others.
Some more than others.
Some have a little bit more of a barrier to entry, but I agree. And I think they are still human.
Exactly.
That's kind of one of the things in the book too, is that the amazing person who diagnosed me and the team and people who didn't and kind of failed.
Yeah.
They're all people.
Yeah.
And they make mistakes.
Exactly.
And the importance of a different opinion or getting a second opinion, the importance of listening to yourself.
Yeah.
If things don't sound good, if the doctor doesn't treat you well, if you feel you're not being heard, like you have to trust that and you have to trust your gut on that and get a second opinion.
Yeah.
Easier said than done, but it's true.
And I think you're the perfect advocate for both sides, right? Because you've done so much research and you now fully understand what a lot of the physicians are going through. Obviously, you understand it as a patient. And I think like really understanding that, hey, we are all, or hopefully we're all trying our best.
Yes.
I like to believe.
I do too.
Your life
you need to believe that.
Your life is so much easier if you believe
Yes.
everyone has the best intentions.
I agree.
Obviously, you're going to be let down in some cases, but at least you're not. At least you can listen to other people and who are trying to help you with of like, hey, maybe I should listen to that, right?
I think it's like having both this idea that people have your best, people are trying to do their best.
Yeah.
But also trusting yourself as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Both those things can be true at the same time.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah.
I think that is huge what you just said.
Yeah.
Do you ever sit back and think, I am a #1 New York Times bestseller? Like, did you ever think this was going to go that way when you were, of course you started young.
No.
So,
no. I mean, when I went to sell the book, which in nonfiction you sell on a proposal for a book, it's not the book itself. So it's like basically like, here's an idea I have and here's a couple chapters.
Yeah.
And so when I went out on proposal, every publisher but one rejected it. They didn't want it. They thought it was too rare. People wouldn't be interested in it. People wouldn't relate to it. So that's why it's so interesting to me because I thought, I'd reach people who had my diagnosis or maybe they're doctors.
Yeah.
But the life that it's had beyond it just exceeded any expectation that I had or my publisher had. I mean, no one saw that coming at all.
Yeah. Wow.
So I constantly think, oh my gosh, like it's amazing. And we'll be honest, like you're always like, oh, the other shoe's going to drop. They're all going to figure out I'm a fraud. I'm not actually good at that. Like you always have that, but it's been amazing. And
it's so crazy how we can actually talk ourselves into that kind of thought
I think
process.
Everyone has that, right?
100%. Yeah. I think if you're a manager of a EEG department, you don't get, or so you feel like someone's going to expose you and you'll lose your job, or all the way up to, they're
going to figure out I'm not actually good at this.
Yeah. Yeah. What is that? I wonder, like, have you ever thought about that?
I think it's maybe like baked into, if you're ambitious in some ways, you're like fighting against that. I think that like humility is good, but I think a little bit of like, I could be better, or like fear or like, I don't know. I think that maybe is a driver. I don't know. I think if you're so complacent or like, I'm great, like where's there to go from there?
Yeah.
There's no like movement in that.
I have an idea that we strive to be a certain person or a certain title or get to a certain level, that we for years have looked at that title as like, you can't really match those expectations or, get to those expectations, that once you actually do,
That's key.
you feel like, oh, this person that I am now, I've thought so highly of for the last 10 years. I've been trying to get there. I don't know if I'm there yet.
I think that's key.
Don't you?
You're like, this is what it is?
Yeah.
I'm here in that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's true.
When I started Arium EEG, which was bought by CortiCare, the whole time I thought at some point the bottom is going to drop out. And although I'd been doing it for 20 years, I felt like an absolute fraud. And that's wild.
That's wild.
Yeah. Do you experience that with your other books? Like, what is do you have higher expectations now with your books that you're writing?
You can't help it. I had no expectations for my first book. Zero.
Yeah.
I was just so happy. And I was so happy that someone wanted my writing. I mean, I've always dreamed of writing a book. And the fact that like someone actually was doing that was enough for me. And I always have to remind myself that the goal is, my goal is that someone will keep paying me to write books.
Yeah.
I don't need to be rich and famous or have a huge bestseller. I just need for it to be a situation where someone will keep wanting to, that's that's basically what I'm striving for. And I have a lot of friends who are writers, and when your book's coming out, everyone goes a little batty because you're reading the reviews online and you're freaking out and sales figures are coming. And, it's a very fraught time, and you can lose that thread, and you can use the reason why you're doing this and how like special it is, and how you should really be grateful that you have that.
What helps you? What do you say to yourself when you feel yourself gravitating towards the higher expectations?
Yeah.
Like, what would you, is there something that you really think about? I think saying, as long as someone's paying me, that's really the basis.
Yeah. I mean, like that I have the opportunity that but I think also it's like, did I do my best?
Yes.
Am I proud of the work I did? And then it has to be enough.
Yeah.
Because you can't control how many books you're going to sell. Yeah. You can't control how people are going to react to it.
Yeah.
If someone gives me another opportunity to write a book, I'm happy. That's what I want for my career, is just to keep being able to do what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so far it's working.
Hopefully. Yeah.
You're on your third.
Yep. Book. Third is coming out in April.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah. So it's fun. It's different. Each book has been progressively.
Yeah.
I'm further and further away from the topic. So obviously Brain on Fire is a memoir. Mm-hmm. My second book, The Great Pretender, I'm in it, but more as a kind of narrator, guide, I would say. I'm an investigator.
Yeah.
But, the main character is a man named David Rosenhan, who did this famous study on being sane in insane places where people went undercover in psychiatric hospitals. And so it starts with him, and then I'm in the story because I start to kind of investigate the story, and it starts to unravel. So it becomes a kind of mystery too. Yeah. It kind of continues that Brain on Fire thing. So my third book, which is called The Acid Queen, which is coming out again in April, that one's more of a straight biography, and I only emerge at the very end. And I have a little bit to say about my relationship with the subject. But this is a woman, is basically a biography of an unknown woman in the kind of the 60s counterculture psychedelic world. Mm-hmm. And she was kind of a lost and erased figure, and a fascinating woman who kind of allows me to do kind of a historical character study. Because name a figure of that era. You have John Lennon pops up, Gloria Steinem pops up, the Black Panthers are in it, and the Weather Underground. I mean, you name a person, Allen Ginsberg. So, all of a sudden, all these figures are in her life and swirling around her, and she never kind of got her due because she was erased from that record for various reasons and went underground and lived under another name. And so it's great. It was such fun. I love her. She died before I met her, but I got access to her years of diaries and a book in progress that she hadn't published. And I really got into her mind. Yeah. And so it felt very personal, but it was really fun to not actually be in it. At all, really, in this time around.
I bet that does give you a little bit of weight off your shoulders.
Yeah, a little bit.
Like, hey, let's tell someone else's story.
It's fun.
And I don't have to, you almost live up to, again, Brain on Fire. And it's like, what are you proud about? What's different about this book than your other two books that you're proud of?
Yeah, I think that the kind of straight biography and not having a crutch of myself.
Yeah.
And there, of course, my voice is there because
course.
I'm still the person telling the story.
Yes.
I'm really proud of how this is one that is far more plot heavy and more kind of, in a way, cinematic than the other two. There's a lot of personal scenes in there that I hope really come to life, and it's about an era I don't know. I didn't live it, so it was really it took a kind of novelistic approach, even though obviously it's not a novel, it's nonfiction, but it really kind of pushed me to use more of that kind of storytelling side of things. Yeah,
you do such a good job of that.
Thank you.
And I think people obviously can pick up on authors who are trying too hard and authors who don't try at all. And I'm being judgmental when I shouldn't be, because there's no way I could even come close to even a quote unquote terrible author. But what I do know of the authors that I've read in the past, they're great storytellers, and you are, like I said, one of the best storytellers I've ever read, really. So yeah, so I'm super excited about the
That's very nice for you to say. I think you'll have fun. There's kind of a mystery too. Why did she go underground? But it's really kind of a rich character study, I think. I mean, she's amazing. Whether or not my writing, forget it. Just who she is, and the fact that no one really knows who she is, and it was just it felt like I loved every second of writing this book. Like my second book. I mean, obviously, my first book had its own feelings. Yeah. My second book was about mental illness. It was heavy, and I'm very proud of that book. But I would say it's more academic. It's definitely more about ideas, although a person did anchor the book. But this one, though, I do talk about what's going on in the culture, about psychedelics in general. So you have some of that science side of things that I do love too, and history. Yeah. But it really is about a woman. Yeah. A very kind of deep and intimate portrait of one woman. So is psychedelics a major part of it? I mean, with the title? Okay. Yes. Yeah. So she was married to Timothy Leary. Do you know who that is? Yeah. So she was married to him during the height of his notoriety. And she was definitely a person who experimented with all sorts of substances, but mostly acid. Yeah. And took it seriously as, I wouldn't say they would call it a medicine, but kind of a sacrament, they would have called it. They saw it in more religious terms, but they saw both sides kind of married both things, which is happening right now, obviously. With the medical side too, sacrament's always been around, but there's been kind of merging or a blurring of those, and it's obviously a huge part of psychiatry right now, medicine in general. Discussion of what are we going to do with these substances. So that was my entree into it. I thought, these are really interesting questions about consciousness, about mental health. And so in general, that was the big picture thing I wanted to explore. And then I found her. Yeah. And I would say those are explored, but it's not the driving force of the book. The driving force is this amazing woman. Yeah. If that makes sense. Absolutely. Yeah. And it sounds like 2 and 3 components of a really great book, especially now, with the advancements in psychedelics and the sponsorships and endorsements from prominent people in psychedelics. Where do you think, and this is probably going to be uncovered in your newest book, but where do you think psychedelics is going as far as being just mainstream go-to therapies for patients who are struggling with, things such as bipolar disorder or depression or, maybe even just a mood stimulant? Where do you think that's going? It's complicated because it's really dependent on kind of scheduling of drugs. Right now it's a Schedule I drug. So you can't you're not supposed to be able to study it or use it. But obviously there are changes going on with that. So that's key. What will happen there? And then the question will be with the FDA. Will they approve this for use in therapeutic settings? So that's the major question right now. And are you hopeful for that? I am. I believe that these substances should be legal. The medicalization, I have some questions about because our system is very broken with psychiatry in particular. We don't have time for patients as it is. And these are intensive, long, oftentimes. There are some substances that are not as long, like DMT or something, but these are intensive experiences that take hours. the kind of integration that is required afterward also takes hours from, a qualified professional who can spend that time, and where is the money that's going to go to
Right.
fund this? So, if we can't have people who have serious mental illness seeing, psychiatrists, I mean, there is a dearth of psychiatrists here. I'm not to say that psychiatrists will be the only people dealing in this, hopefully, but the fact is our mental health care system is broken. So I think umbrellaing it within a broken system might not work.
Yeah.
So not to say that I'm against anything, I just have some questions about how it might look. And I think those are the real issues now.
Taking an intellectually honest approach is kind of sounds like is the
Yeah,
best way.
I would say, yeah. I mean, she was someone who, though she was very, did a lot of work with them, was very circumspect about their use. And she didn't believe that they were for everyone.
Yeah.
And she did think there was a danger in over-proselytizing or being in kind of evangelical, which she was in the beginning with many people who take psychedelics recreationally typically or therapeutically without having like deep trauma or PTSD. There can be a period of kind of narcissism and evangelical kind of reaction to that that you see, and that people want to just turn everyone into taking these substances, or they feel they may be morally superior because the insights that they've accrued during their trips. And she warned against that way back when, because she experienced it. And he, Timothy Leary, very flawed human, experienced all that too. Yeah. So in a way, it's a celebration and a warning.
Yeah.
This book, I would say.
Well, I think that's the responsible approach.
Yeah.
Right? A celebration and a caution to just about anything. The trending mentality on things, if there's someone who's a proponent of a certain anything and they endorse it, the people jumping on without kind of any personal inflection or, thinking about their own personal well-being, maybe they just jump into it and it's like, well, you should probably do your research before you. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think I think that these are, from what we can tell, typically the downsides are very small, but there are people who do have downsides from these. And when you kind of start widening the pool, like some of the downsides can be serious. That's true with Tylenol.
Yep.
That's true with alcohol. It's true with any substance, mostly any substance you put in your body. Not everyone reacts the same way to it. So, I think that's true of everything.
Yeah. Well, Susannah, it's been an absolute pleasure.
It's been
Thank
a
you
total
so
pleasure.
much.
Thank you so much for a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed myself.
As I told you earlier, you put my mind at ease. I was super nervous. The funny thing is, some of my coworkers, they were like, "Are you nervous?" And I was like, "Yeah." And they're like, "I'm nervous for you." So I think on the other side of the lens, in the social media, I think, neurodiagnostic technologists such as myself and neurologists are very nervous for me. And I just want to say that she's been absolutely fantastic. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
And let's do this again whenever,
would love to.
Your next book goes crazy. We'll sit down and talk about it.
Let's do it. I would love that.
All right. Well, thank you very much.